Hello, and welcome to the IR Digital Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Riggins, and today we will be discussing GDPR, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, with Colin Smith, Corporate and Commercial Partner at Blaser Mills Law. This is a follow-up to a previous episode of this podcast entitled Countdown to GDPR, Are You Ready?, that published before it went into effect in May of 2018. That's still available for you on our IR Digital SoundCloud. Today, we're going to briefly recap what GDPR is, what it actually means in action, any updates to it, and how to balance compliance with marketing, as that is definitely a challenge we're going through today. So, Colin, how are you doing today?
Very good indeed. Thanks, Jennifer.
That's good to hear. And can you briefly explain the work you do in the context of GDPR?
Yes, by all means. As a corporate commercial lawyer, clearly contracts loom large in my work, and GDPR has had a major impact on commercial contracts in the UK and across the EU. But in fact, also here at Blaser Mills, we've spearheaded a project team to help clients with GDPR implementation, and I'm also part of that team. So I've been involved in client training and various other aspects of GDPR as well as just the contracts.
And when you talk about contracts, what do you mean? I think a lot of people are aware of it more from the newsletter standpoint or in the omnipresent pop-ups on anything we look at on the internet now regarding cookies. But what is the effect in the contract area?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is, to summarize, sort of customer communication or data subject communication, whether that's privacy notice or what have you on your website or via email. But as well as that, in the commercial arena, most commercial arrangements between businesses involve processing data. And commonly, that means that one or other party is a data controller, the other's a data processor. And GDPR mandates that where that's the case, certain compulsory provisions are included in your contracts. So it's a pretty important thing to have reviewed and make sure you're compliant.
And is this something that all size companies need to worry about, or just the big companies?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jennifer. There's no small company exemption at all in GDPR. So just to recap, the regulation applies to all processing of personal data that relates to data subjects anywhere within the EU. And the only exemption really is for processing by ordinary people in the course of personal or household activity. So any other organization, a company, a business, a charity, not-for-profit, doesn't matter how big or how small you are, the rules apply to you.
And are you finding that companies are actually adhering to these rules, or were they prepared in May, or are they rushing to catch up now?
That's a very good question. I think you've got the whole spectrum of responses from businesses who still have their head in the sand. They're vaguely aware that this thing called GDPR has gone on, but it's definitely nothing to do with us. And you have other people who've been all over it like a rash. So they were preparing it months, if not years, in advance. To one degree or another, as soon as the 23rd of May came, the new policies, the new provisions, they were all in place, hyper vigilant, and right from the word go. So we've really seen the whole gamut.
But is it that important from a user perspective? From a marketing perspective, I respect GDPR. From a human perspective, I definitely respect that my data is being processed and I'm aware of the data, but I'm just hitting accept all the time. So basically, I'm complicit in giving away my data as much as possible, but are companies overreacting to this new legislation and with all these pop-ups and everything happening, or is it that important? And does it really matter if all we're doing is accepting these conditions?
Yeah, I mean, there are two main things that companies have been doing. Most of the pop-ups that you see on websites relate to cookies and getting cookie consent. And there's really been a sea change brought in by GDPR. I mean, you did see cookie consent pop-ups before, but they were relatively few and far between. It's very rare now to go to a website and not be confronted with one. It's needed. It's not possible to be compliant as a website provider without getting consent to your cookies. And it doesn't dramatically affect the user experience. It's people have got used to it. It's pretty quick and easy. Most of them have been designed in such a way as to be fairly unobtrusive. We've come to expect it as part of the territory, I guess. The other thing that particularly users would have experienced in the immediate aftermath of the GDPR coming on is, of course, this great flood of emails dumped into your inbox, asking for your consent. And certainly it's our view that quite a lot of businesses have taken a very safety first, belt and braces approach, and perhaps asked for the detailed consent when they didn't need to. There are relatively few businesses who are relying, as we think they could, on legitimate interest or the soft opt-in they might previously have got from existing customers under the privacy regulations. And they're really making absolutely certain they're covered by going out and asking for that consent again. Now, it may be that some of those businesses have lost subscribers because of taking that approach.
A lot of subscribers, I imagine. Like my co-working, which I subscribe and pay as a customer, just opted everyone out, and it is a challenge actively to opt back in. And it's probably the only newsletter I would want. Yeah. But I'm a paying customer there, so it seemed to me like they were overreacting in unsubscribing paying customers from their newsletter instead of just having the default unsubscribe button at the bottom.
As long as you're contacting existing customers with a view to selling them similar products or services to the ones they've bought from you before, and at the time you originally put them on the system, they at least have the chance to opt out, then you've got them under what's known as soft opt-in, and most practitioners would say that's okay to carry on contacting those customers.
As long as they have a way to opt out, always.
Yeah, you need to have done it the very first time they went on your system, and then at relatively regular intervals since. You're then fine to carry on with them. You don't need to go out and get that consent fresh.
Okay, and then it's required by law you have to have, or is this just a policy of most email marketing tools that you have to have an unsubscribe button at the bottom?
Oh, well, back in the day, which is when we're talking about for this soft opt-in, you couldn't have the soft opt-in if you didn't have the unsubscribe. So
okay.
Obviously lots of people didn't. They were relying pre-GDPR on having just it being a legitimate interest to contact customers because they were your customers. Strictly speaking, now we're in GDPR. If that's where you're at, you do need to go out and get consent from those people. And of course, it may be that for a lot of these people who've been clogging up our inboxes, that's the position they found themselves in. They took advice and they reacted accordingly. But I suspect quite a lot of them did it anyway when perhaps they didn't need to.
I guess part of the problem is the deluge happened all in 2 weeks in May. So none of us could open all of those emails to re-opt into anything. Well, so we're in a pickle now, and the most successful marketing technique is email, and yet now what can we do? So what are the options? Have new marketing strategies come into effect because of GDPR, or new ways to skirt but overcome?
we now know you have to get consent if you're going to hook people in who are not purchasing something from you at the moment you bring them in. If you're effectively in one way or another cold contacting them, people are just finding more and more ingenious ways of hooking those people in, whether that's through competitions, introductory offers. You need to find a hook to bring the person with you and make them want to hit the yes button.
Absolutely. And that's not bad for us as consumers. I guess just a lot of us are already getting into the habit of just accepting. we should, it's probably part of GDPR is to make us more aware of how we're giving our data away, but we're kind of just blindly accept, because it's easier. And I would say maybe the user experience isn't bad on the desktop, but I think on your phone it can take up the entire screen and isn't always great. I'm also finding the US, I believe if my understanding of GDPR is correct, that any websites or companies that have customers in Europe have to be GDPR compliant, yes?
Yes, that's entirely right. In fact, not just customers, but if you in any way track consumers, individuals who are located within the EU, then you're also caught by GDPR. And of course, these days, that could include automatic tracking through cookies or other electronic means. So absolutely, can apply to organisations outside the EU.
Okay, within the EU, what's happened to those that are non-compliant? I kind of hope there was a little comfort zone, maybe a couple weeks or a month or two as people were catching up in June, July. But now that GDPR is really out there, are there any cases where a company's been prosecuted due to not complying?
The truth of the matter, certainly here in the UK, is that it's still too early to tell. The regulator in the UK, that's the ICO, is still pretty busy investigating data breaches that took place considerably before the GDPR. So there's a certain amount of catch up. Clearly there have been breaches since May the 23rd, but where the investigation and the outcome hasn't caught up yet. So we haven't yet seen anything big published that tells us, okay, what's the difference going to be? We can see what the attitude is to the last raft of breaches prior to the change. We're still waiting with bated breath to see what's going to be different, if anything, with the ones that come just afterwards.
And for the non-British listeners, that the ICO is the Information Commissioner's UK office.
That's right. There'll be a regulator in every EU country who's tasked with enforcing the regulation, and in the UK, that's the ICO.
And until that happens, is there a risk of companies forgetting about it and going lenient? Maybe when they have an update to WordPress, not adding the pop-up again and things. Is there a risk until the big threat of it all pops up?
I don't think so. I mean, there are certainly here in the UK, and I don't think there's any reason to think we're different from the trend anywhere else. In the year or so, the 18 months leading up to this change, that there were increasingly a number of high-profile data breaches, and whilst the level of fines imposed is lower, because of course the cap previously was relatively modest, and as we all know, GDPR significantly increased the headroom for perpetrators being hit with large fines by the regulators. Nevertheless, it's pretty widely publicized in the press, in online. These breaches happening, these organizations being reported, being caught, and the consequences. We're pretty sure that when we start looking at the breaches that happen after 23rd of May, we're going to see some bigger numbers, but we await to see how much bigger.
And we're not just talking about fines. There's clearly a public opinion penalty if you are treating data poorly, which Facebook and other companies are seeing and are hazards of. So people are more aware of their privacy. Do you see this as an overall trend since May, that there's been other trends popping up about organizational governance, about privacy usage, data usage, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, the two hot topics, and obviously security is a very hot topic. Of course, GDPR brought in a lot more new rules and regulations than just data breach. In particular, the individual rights that data subjects have. But I think it's fair to say that in the public imagination, it's these vast data breaches that are the biggest issue. You know, the worry that along with thousands of other people, your sensitive, perhaps financial data, you know, can be cast to the four winds and fall into entirely the wrong hands. So yeah, the only way to minimize the risk of that is to up the ante on the security front. So that's loomed large into the corporate mindset. The other development I would say is there's been a pretty universal buy-in for those who have put measures in place to deal with GDPR to make somebody responsible, to put in place an internal, preferably an individual person who will be the responsible for GDPR implementation and who will be the focal point of contact externally, both for data subjects and for the regulator. You know, whether that's person's called the data protection manager or some other title, that's pretty common. In terms of appointing data protection officers, which are of course the statutory mandatory position for certain organisations, what we've really seen is nobody's doing that unless they have to. You know, if you're one of those organisations who's required by law to appoint a DPO, you will. Everybody else has the option to do it. Pretty much nobody else is. And perhaps that's not surprising, because if you volunteer to do it, you get treated by the regulator as if it was compulsory for you. And that's pretty onerous.
Just to repeat that back, you're saying there are a few people that would have required DPO, but if you do have a DPO and you're not required, you're still treated under the same compulsory power.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the people who need one are public authorities, not counting the courts, but pretty much everybody else, and commercial organizations whose core activities involve regular, systematic and large-scale monitoring of data subjects, or whose core activities consist of large-scale processing of special categories of data or data relating to criminal convictions and offences. Now, those are quite specialist areas. I mean, that's kind of saying, you know, you're either a data processing company, you know, your business is about data processing, or you work in a particular area, most notably, you know, health, children, the criminal justice system, where the data that you process is particularly sensitive. But for most other organizations, you're not caught by that, and you don't have to appoint a DPO.
So banking, fintech, finance don't have to appoint a DPO.
Well, bank's a pretty big organization.
I was thinking that, with a lot of sensitive data.
And I don't think banks actually fall into the special categories of data one, but if you look at the other definition, regular, systematic, large-scale monitoring, I guess it depends what the bank's doing with the huge database of customer information that they've got. But I would be surprised if most large retail banks were not caught by that and were required to have a DPO in place.
And it seems silly if they wouldn't anyway, because they should. And from my understanding of GDPR, all companies have to at least have mapped out, in case they're investigated, in case they're questioned by they have to have someone that is kind of their untitled chief of data and have to map out the data flow, correct?
Yes, I mean, the two sides of that, even if you realize and decide that you don't have to appoint a DPO, you should nevertheless have considered it and have a note, a board note or something somewhere that shows your thinking in deciding that you didn't need it. And you're absolutely right, Jennifer, even if you don't need the statutory appointment, it's very, very sensible to have somebody whose focus is GDPR. It's not a legal requirement under GDPR, but the unofficial seventh data principle, which is a major part of compliance, is demonstrating compliance. Well, you don't half help your efforts in demonstrating if you have someone who is that focus and who's really dedicated to this particular issue.
We definitely went through that on a team I was in that is a remote team of about 10 people. And we still had someone who was asking us questions and asking, okay, where is this data stored? How do you know who has access? Since most of the organization data was on an enterprise Google Drive account.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but you're just sharing links with that, and you're sharing links with your external customers, and how are they removed, and who has access to what, and how do you be sure that not everyone has access? It's quite easy to lose track with Google Drive of who has access to what. So I think the exercise, even for a very small company that probably wouldn't be targeted for investigation, especially distributed around Europe company and around the world, but it was an incredibly valuable exercise for all of us to say, oh dear.
No, I would agree. I would agree with that. I mean, I think we all believe that when the backlog's cleared, that regulators will start with the bigger fish and the bigger issues. But when they start coming further down the pecking order, as it were, one imagines there's going to be some element of random investigation. I mean, I guess that the closest analogy is the tax authorities, isn't it? And it's as well to be prepared just in case yours is the one that comes into focus.
Data audits will be the new thing we're terrified of, but rightfully so. I definitely interviewed someone last week that she's a CEO of a very small fintech company, but they work with API gateways and payment gateways. So they have a chief data officer because their data flow is that important, and everyone needs to be thinking about data now.
Oh, that sounds absolutely essential. I mean, we'd certainly recommend that the most important thing to do first, if you happen to be one of those organizations that's a bit behind the eight ball here and is playing catch up, the first thing to do is to carry out your own data audit, to get a proper understanding of what data it is that you do hold, where is it, how is it, what security is in place. Because only then can you start planning the measures you might take to safeguard it.
And this can't be just legal and IT. This has to be all teams together, because a lot of teams touch a lot of data, including your accountants or your marketing team.
It's going to, done properly, the data audit is going to touch your entire organization. It's, in the modern day and age, it's almost inconceivable that you'd have any employees at all who weren't regularly processing personal data.
So hopefully back in May, when we were all receiving emails from all the newsletters, a lot of companies, or most companies, were sending out notifications to their employees to make sure everyone was aware of it, because GDPR seems to really impact everyone, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does. Well, one would certainly hope that was the case. I mean, we certainly found ourselves advising many clients in the lead up to GDPR, and certain other ones immediately afterwards. A little bit catch up, but it's never too late. And certainly, I think one of the messages at the moment would be, if you haven't got all your ducks in order yet, there's still time. It's these regulations are not going to go away. There's still time to get everything in place.
So it's not oh well, we've missed it, let's just wait and see when we get in trouble situation. It's, well, you were late, but you'll probably be okay if you do it now situation?
It's definitely the case that if you think there are any shortfalls in your GDPR armor, as it were, don't stick your head in the sand. Get it sorted now. Start the ball rolling.
Earlier, you were talking about in the terms of the trends in organizational governance, and you were talking about how data leaks are making the news. Does GDPR actually help prevent data leaks? Or does it just make it more publicity and more public?
Well, certainly it's raised awareness, and even if there was nothing in GDPR itself that was a legal requirement, that in itself has put the onus on businesses to do more about data security. But of course, data security is one of the key principles of GDPR. Anyone who's a data controller is required to take appropriate technical, physical, and organizational steps, to ensure that the personal data they process is secure. That's it's been enshrined there. It's got the big stick of the new larger fines that are available if that all goes wrong. It hasn't half focused minds on getting that security level higher.
Fantastic, Colin. And scary for a lot of companies still listening on this call. But if you're listening, get your act together, right? And now, just are there 3 key points or recommendations you give an organization that still needs to improve their data protection policy? I think one is clearly have a data audit. You said anything else you would recommend?
I think I'd really just pull together 3 things we've already touched upon. That the data audit's the starting point. You need to understand where you're at the moment, and then 2 things really flow out of that. One is security. That's going to be a combination of internal systems and IT. The legal side of it's pulling everything together. And the other side would be to go really right back to where we came in with this conversation, and it's all about the documentation. Your contracts, your privacy notices, every which way you communicate with your customers and with your suppliers and with your employees. All of that wants to be compliant and to show compliance, because, of course, as we mentioned earlier, demonstrating compliance goes a long, long way to being compliant.
Absolutely. And talking about it, the whole process leads to a lot of conversations that break down walls within your organization. And security is part of user experience.
No, absolutely right. And that first point there, Jennifer, that's very true. I think a lot of organizations who've gone through the data audit have found it's had benefits far in excess and over and above the simply understanding data, pulling teams together, giving people around the organization a better understanding of how other elements of it work, identifying gaps in knowledge, gaps in management, never mind data. Can be a very, very useful exercise for all sorts of reasons.
Are you finding some of your clients, or have you heard stories of companies that in going through this process found out they were doing something very wrong and they had to notify their customers? Or is it something that just after May 25th, they really need to make sure it's in place by then? Or is it helping companies be more transparent with their customers?
I think it helps. Certainly is helping transparency. The main among our clients where things were uncovered that perhaps required some fairly systematic changes have primarily been around data storage, how it's long after it's been used, where's it being held, why is it being held, who and how can it be accessed, and quite a lot of the things that perhaps aren't top of mind. It tends to be people who are the currently being targeted with marketing messages, or are existing customers. GDPR's top of their mind. They're the ones who've been phoning in and querying or complaining or what have you. But your ex-employees, your ex-customers, people who perhaps have sat in databases for sometimes many years, that's the sort of thing that an audit has brought to light, that very often new policies and new procedures have had to be brought in to deal with that.
It definitely gives us more powers as consumers, and we should take that. I was with those meal companies that send you a couple meals a week kits, and I left them, and I could not opt out of any of their messaging. Finally, Twitter with hashtag GDPR is a very valuable tool as a consumer, and I've stopped receiving their newsletters for their mediocre meals. So we have more power as consumers. So while we have responsibilities as running businesses, we have power as consumers, and we have to remember that. And hopefully GDPR will be a constant reminder to each of us.
Very much so.
Thank you so very much, Colin, for this great insight into the complex world of GDPR. And thank you to everyone who's listening today and every day. The IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors with extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals need to know about. And Colin clearly is a great resource for this. To learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it on any of our many social media and with your colleagues and friends. And Colin, if our listeners wanted to follow up with you directly about GDPR or any of your services, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, if you get into our website, blasermills.co.uk, and that's Blaser with an S, not a Z. Look me up. My email address will be on there, and drop me a line. I'd be pleased to respond.
And that is Colin Smith, and you've been incredibly helpful. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the listeners. Have a great day and good luck with GDPR.